honor to be with the president of South Africa, President Ramaphosa, and he is a man who is certainly in some circles really respected, other circles a little bit less respected, like all of us in all fairness, like all of us.
We all like that.
Awkward start to a tense meeting between President Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa that some are likening to the Oval Office ambush of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
President Ramaphosa making the trip to Washington to, quote, reset the relationship between the two countries after South Africa was one of the many countries targeted by Trump's tariffs and has been accused by President Trump of condoning a genocide on white South Africans or Afrikaners.
At one point, Trump even stopped the press event to play a video of a South African party leader calling for the killing of white farmers. That president, Ramaphosa, pushed back hard on those comments. Let's watch.
Our government policy is completely against what he was saying. And they're a small minority party, which is allowed to exist in terms of our constitution.
But you do allow them to take land.
No.
You do allow them to take land.
Nobody can take land.
And then when they take the land, they kill the white farmer. Look, these are articles over the last few days. Death, 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 horrible death.
Trump then turned his attention to the press in the room, and he railed against the media for not covering what he calls a genocide. Take a look.
We had real reporters, they'd be covering it, but the fake news in this country doesn't talk about that. Why did they give us a plane to the United States Air Force? That's what that idiot talks about after viewing a thing where thousands of people are dead.
I'm sorry, I don't have a plane to give you.
I wish you did. Okay.
The two world leaders are set to meet again today at the White House. And hopefully it's not as much of a disaster as yesterday. Wait, let me tell you. As a journalist, I just don't understand. So he's pulling up articles and saying death, death, death. Okay, if we go through the amount of murders that happened in, let's say, New York City, just an easy example, would we call that a genocide if we went through the articles, death, death, death? That's what he's talking about. He's not showing real information and real facts that relate to a genocide. And so when you look at the numbers, because I did, 60 white farmers were killed last year in South Africa. And while any amount of farmers that are killed is a bad thing, that is not that's a very minuscule number compared to the 19,000 South Africans as a whole that were murdered last year. There is a crime problem in South Africa, having spent a lot of time there, and I think he needs to stop combing over the real issue and talk about the actual issue, which is why we're deciding and picking and choosing who we're letting into the country based on dire circumstances, when one country actually has a dire circumstance like Venezuela and another country actually does not have a dire circumstance. And so, like Tim Kaine said when he was yelling at Marco Rubio,
their leaders are calling for them to be killed, but
no. Okay, so let me go back and explain that to everybody. So there in the 1980s, when there still was apartheid in South Africa, there was a chant called "Kill the Boer," and they were saying let's get rid of this oppression and apartheid. Do you know what was happening during apartheid? Black people or black South Africans were being killed. Yeah. So naturally,
I don't want to kill black people or white people.
No. Naturally, there was naturally there was a revolt against saying they didn't want to be oppressed anymore, and so that turned into something under Nelson Mandela's party that turned into a resistance movement that was get us out of this oppression. And so that's what that chant was. But that chant didn't actually lead to any deaths. And so now we saw Ramaphosa, he's not even associated with the same party as Nelson Mandela. So none of his party or anybody around his party is chanting "Kill the Boer." And it's more important to note that while freedom of speech is actually intact in South Africa and also should be in the United States, people can chant, like you said, whatever they want. And it doesn't mean, unless they're actually doing negative, harming actions, that they can be prosecuted for it. So showing these articles and showing the video of a protest does not lead to causation of death in South Africa of farmers. It's just actually not a genocide. And so I just want to be telling the truth, especially coming from the man who claims that fake news is running rampant. He's actually providing fake information. There's not a genocide in South Africa.
Well, I didn't call it a genocide. I think killing is wrong. I mean, genocide is, you asked if I would describe the New York situation. No, although, if people, genocide is if people are being, deliberately killed by some organized force, some government or something for reasons of racial or religious oppression, right?
But the
That's
people
how
who killed the farmer were the
genocide.
same random acts as the same people that killed
Okay,
people
it's all
and
random
murders
acts.
in New York.
I just don't care. This is beside the point to me, because the issue is whether they should be allowed to immigrate here. And I have no problem with them immigrating here. And our government has no problem with them immigrating here. And it sounds like you don't really have a problem with them immigrating here either. So then what's the issue? They're coming here, a small number of affluent white farmers. It's fine. Done.
The bigger issue is
Stamp that passport, baby.
President Trump has a track record of publicly humiliating people that are supposed to be our allies in the Oval Office on television. And so again, this was another visually stunning moment, like we saw with Lindsey, where he is condescending a world leader to what reason, to what end? That world leader came here to actually try to open up trade, like with South Africa, and Elon Musk was there because he wants to bring in more charging stations to South Africa and thinks it'll be a great place for Elon Musk to continue investing. Having spent time there are plenty of rich people in South Africa, but Trump came there with a different agenda. He came there to try to target every reporter that had a question about anything else he has going on.
Well, they don't want the U.S. government
articles just to do this.
They don't want
and do this whole.
Let me say that they don't want the U.S. government's help building charging stations in South Africa, because we built zero, even with $1 gazillion spent on the project, because we can't build anything in this freaking country. I think it is a benefit of Donald Trump that he just what happens behind closed doors under Democratic governance or normal governance happens out in the open under Trump, and I think that's a benefit. Right. He had the fight with Zelensky that probably another leader would have had behind closed doors that you wouldn't have heard about. You would have heard some orchestrated media report about how they're on the same page.
But he didn't have the fight with Putin.
But you say it in person.
He didn't have the fight with Putin. He had a closed door meeting for 2 hours.
Trump just says what's on his
mind.
mind.
Putin has not came to a resolution.
So he says it in public. I think that's good.
He gets pushed around by certain people, and then he tries to embarrass other people. Like Putin is pushing him around. He hasn't come to the table with Ukraine, not that we heard of all week, and it was imminent when we heard them talk last time.
I like having a president who knows who he's talking to and is capable of some exchange, unlike, again, our previous president, who Democrats were going to, as a corpse, drag over the finish line and pretend he was capable of talking to world leaders. If it gets combative, that's fine. And honestly, they seemed like they were on perfectly good terms by the end of it.
But part of it is just that he's asking why the press isn't covering a genocide, and it's the same reason why we're not covering a genocide when someone's murdered in any other city in the United States. It's the same reason why China isn't covering genocides when a murder happens in the United States that has nothing to do with one specific
I don't think we want to get into China not
covering
genocides.
Whatever it is.
China is very much not covering some genocides going on in China.
It's why Europe doesn't cover local murders. You know what I mean? He's not making sense.
And actually, China probably does cover every last thing the United States does wrong. Look at the evil Western imperialists and how bad their country is.
I just want him.
Stay in your home, citizen. Do not dissent.
I want him to be honest. That's not a huge task, a tall order for a president. I want him to be honest. And so I want him just to say what this actually is. I don't think anyone should be murdered. I condone violence in all of its forms. But I do think our president should be honest and not ask why the press isn't covering something that's a local issue with crime and has more to do with socioeconomic status in South Africa as opposed to race in South Africa. So.
RFK Jr. next up, slamming the World Health Organization over its handling of COVID. More Rising right after this.